Scott Hansen here from NFL Red Zone. I hope you're checking out 1 hour of 5 Yard Rush, one of the best podcasts on NFL football in the UK.
Hello, Rush Nation, and welcome to the 5 Yard Dynasty Show. Week 4 is in the books, and I cannot believe that we're pretty much a quarter of the way through the fantasy season. I mean, I can't believe how quickly it has been going. It's been an absolute whirlwind, but really enjoying the season so far, despite the Bengals being absolutely terrible. So let's get to it and review Week 4. So let's have a look at the top scorers this week. So at quarterback, back in the elite tier once again. It's been a while, not at all this season he's been there, but QB1 Josh Allen with 36.5 fantasy points. QB2 putting in a great performance. The rookie Anthony Richardson, thankfully back from his concussion now, and he scored 29.6 fantasy points. And then QB3 Lamar Jackson at 28.1 fantasy points. At running back one, the legend himself, Christian McCaffrey, off that fantastic performance, 48.7 PPR fantasy points. Running back 2, David Montgomery coming back from his injury. There were questions about how much use he was going to get. Well, he got a lot of use, something we'll discuss a little bit later. He got 34.1 fantasy points. And running back 3, back into elite territory for the first time this season, Josh Jacobs at 27.9 PPR fantasy points. Looking at wide receiver 1 this week, AJ Brown with 38.5 fantasy points PPR. Wide receiver 2, Stephon Diggs, obviously coupling up with Josh Allen, who was there at QB1, 36 PPR fantasy points. And then wide receiver 3, having a storm of a week, Nico Collins at 35.8 PPR fantasy points. Interesting at the tight end position again this week. You know, these touchdowns really seem to make a massive difference. So tight end 1, Cole Kmet got 2 touchdowns, finishing with 27.6 PPR fantasy points. Tight end 2, Mark Andrews, 25 PPR points. And then tight end 3, a massive surprise because you wouldn't necessarily expect this guy from his team, Jonnu Smith, 15.5 PPR fantasy points. I think a lot of people are disappointed to not see that being Kyle Pitts. So not too much big news this week. A few injuries, but nothing too major or season ending, which is really nice, unlike the first few weeks of the season. Some of the biggest ones to talk about: T. Higgins suffered a broken rib. A lot of that is going to be about pain management. Obviously, he is in a contract year, so I think there's a chance he may sit out until he is fully healed, but not totally sure there. He probably will, I reckon, miss at least 1 to 2 weeks. So it will give Tyler Boyd a little bit of a boost. He does get a much higher target share when T. Higgins is out. The issue, obviously, we have this season is the Bengals' offense has been pretty terrible. The only guy or wide receiver, anyway, aside from that kind of blow up fantasy performance in week 2 by T, the only guy really that's been relevant has been Jamar Chase, and that's because they've been scheming him touches. That the offense has managed to score 3 touchdowns over the space of 4 games, and it's looking just stale and really quite terrible. Obviously, I think a lot of this is based on Burrow's calf injury, which he is struggling through at the moment. There's been a lot of discussions about should they be sitting him or should they be playing him. Ultimately, he is going to play this week. I mean, this is a must-win at this point. You know, I think if they lose this week, pretty much the playoff hopes are all but gone. And maybe at that point, they might look to sit him, but I think he's going to try and play through up to the bye week. It's been really tough kind of dealing with this Bengals offense, this fantasy season, because they are vastly underperforming. Joe Burrow is struggling with that injury, and I wouldn't feel wholly comfortable in plugging him into lineups at this point. I think if I had any other options, then I would probably look to start them over Burrow. Having said that, he has said that this week he's feeling the best he has done so far, but I think I would want to see that on the field before I plug him straight in again. Other injuries to note. So Kenny Pickett has suffered a knee injury. It's expected to be out probably a couple of weeks. How much this kind of affects this offense, I'm not totally sure. I mean, next to the Bengals, they are also one of the worst offenses in football this season. Obviously, Mitch Trubisky will take over. I don't think there's probably a massive kind of change for his receivers moving from Pickett to Trubisky. I generally don't like this offense very much at all for fantasy this season, so I'd be avoiding them anyway. I don't think I would be wanting to plug and play any guys. Obviously, the one that you could do would be George Pickens. Mike Evans did suffer a hamstring tweak. Now, obviously, they're on bye this week, so hopefully he won't miss any time. If he does, then Trey Palmer, the wide receiver 3, he may get a boost, so worth having a look and see if he's on waivers or if he is on your taxi squad, because he may be useful at some point over the next couple of weeks. Don't forget, week 5, bye weeks are now upon us. The Chargers, Buccaneers, Browns and Seahawks are all on bye this week, so that will affect your team. So take a look, see who you can pop in there as replacements while they're on their bye. So let's have a look at who we've got as stock up and stock down this week. So stock up, based on his week 4 performance, that has to be Derrick Henry. He had a vintage Derrick Henry performance against my Bengals this week, with 122 rushing yards on 22 attempts, a rushing touchdown, and of course a passing touchdown to finish it all off and add to my embarrassment. And he finished as a running back 7 on the week. Prior to this game, Henry had been struggling so far this season. I think kind of same with the Titans offense. He had been losing snaps to Tajay Spears. Of course, I spoke about Henry in the stock down category last week, but obviously with this game it has to have bumped back up a little bit, and up until this game he had posted negative rush efficiency as well, but obviously this all changed in this game. I personally think, unless you are an absolute contender, I think this is the perfect sell high opportunity here. He's shown that he's not dust and he can still do it, and he may be valuable for a contending team, so I would be trying to sell him on the back of this great performance, because I think ultimately his time with the Titans is coming to an end, and I think Tajay Spears is going to take over probably next season, and although he is obviously King Henry and he's fantastic, I do think his kind of fantasy relevant times are coming to a close, so if you want to sell him, this is now your chance. So obviously David Montgomery finished as a running back 2 this week. He has been off injured, but he had this absolute monster week coming off injury, and he has to be in the stock up category. There were questions coming back from the injury as to what kind of role, he was going to have in this offense. I think while he was out with the injury, there were hopes that Jahmyr Gibbs would kind of start to take over this backfield a little bit, as that first round rookie. We're hoping to see something from him. But I think, his skill set is very different to Montgomery's, and he is a smaller back. So I think they like having Montgomery as this kind of big bruiser, runner, and then having Gibbs coming in and doing the receiving work. They don't trust him in third down pass protection situations. So I think that doesn't help him. He has been having some rushing work, but I think they like Monty as that lead kind of rusher, really. This week, Monty played on 71% of snaps, and he had a 71% opportunity share, resulting in 121 yards, 3 rush touchdowns, and a running back 2 performance. Monty is definitely here to stay in this backfield, and I do think ultimately both running backs will have fantasy value throughout this season, but where David Montgomery is being kind of drafted, in this off season, I do think obviously he is going to have more value based on his ADP versus Jahmyr Gibbs. I think we're getting very excited about Jahmyr Gibbs, and I think he's going to be a fantastic fantasy running back, at some point, but I don't think this is quite his time yet, and Monty is going to keep getting quite a bit of work here. I didn't think I'd be talking about this guy at all, to be honest, but nevertheless, this week, stock up has to be Zach Wilson. Until this week, the Zach Wilson experiment Mark II, had been an absolute complete disaster. But we did see a glimmer of hope. The Kansas City defense, granted, it didn't perform quite as well as they have done so far this season, but I do think Wilson also made some good plays on the night. He's had, in this game, the highest completion percentage of his season of 72%, and obviously threw for 245 yards and 2 touchdowns. The other thing to think about is that he faces the Broncos this week, whose defense is historically bad, and also we saw how great Justin Fields looked as a thrower. So I do think if he can stack back-to-back good weeks, I would be looking to move him at this point, particularly to a QB-needy team. Whilst he's got some value, he's not going to have long-term value. We know that Aaron Rodgers is coming back. I don't see him as a starter long-term in the NFL. So I think you've got to sell while you can. Another stock-up guy, looking at a quarterback, I don't think anybody would have expected this guy to have played as well as he has done so far this season. That's Josh Dobbs of the Arizona Cardinals. And quietly, he's been having a really nice fantasy season. When the Cardinals released Colt McCoy, I think everyone thought that they were going to be focused on tanking for Caleb, getting that 101, but they've been super feisty, and Dobbs has been leading the charge on offense. In the past 3 weeks, he's finished as a QB4, the QB16, and the QB6, and he posted over 20 fantasy points in 2 of those 3 weeks. I do think, based on his performances so far this season, he is a fantasy starter, mainly in your Superflex QB, 2 QB leagues. And I do think you can pop him into your QB2 slot at this time. Now, we know Dobbs historically has been kind of a backup, career backup. But I do think if you're really, really desperate at QB this week and you just need him as a fill-in for a buy or something like that, he may be on waivers. Otherwise, he could be a cheap option that can help you out in kind of start spots this season. So good on you, Josh Dobbs. I hope you continue to perform well because it's quite fun to see this feisty Arizona offense. Let's have a look at a few stock down players. Now, this player is a little bit similar to one that I discussed a couple of weeks ago. This is Jamar Chase. Now, he is obviously an extreme talent. I love the guy. He's on the Bengals. Of course, I'm going to. And I'm not saying that he is going to be stocked down for any period of time. But I do think in the very, very short term, there is a buy window on Jamar Chase. This Bengals offense is struggling, and as a result, so is Jamar. After being drafted as the number 2 fantasy wide receiver in startups this off-season, he's performed and posted a wide receiver 1 performance in only 1 game so far this season. They're trying to scheme him open, they're trying to scheme him touches, but unfortunately, the dysfunction of the offense has just made this a complete struggle. Like I said earlier, they've only scored 3 touchdowns this whole season, which is also affecting his fantasy output because obviously, as well as not having the yards, he's not getting the touchdowns either. Burrow's injured, and this injury is going to linger and take time to recover. I do think if Chase is on a contender in your league, like I said, I think this could be your opportunity for a buy window. If you're interested in having him on your team, this is the chance to go and approach the owner, as I say, particularly if they're a contender, because while his production is disappointing, that he's not contributing enough to help them win a championship. So they may be willing to sell him on to you for another wide receiver, let's say like a Keenan Allen plus. Obviously, you'll need to be adding some picks because Jamar is, extremely valuable. But if they can get something back that will contribute, I think they might be willing to do that. So I would be looking at seeing if I could approach them and buy him if I'm interested. Another stock down player, Jahan Dodson. There was loads of excitement around him this offseason that, this is going to be his breakout year. And I do think he's talented. Obviously, he was, he went in the first round of the NFL draft. But unfortunately, so far, kind of through 4 games of this season, in terms of fantasy, this has just not really been the case. We know his role on the team. He's a clear wide receiver 2, only behind Terry McLaurin. And over the past 4 games, he has been on the field for the majority of the snaps with a route participation of over 72% in every game. And in actually 3 of those 4 games, his route participation was over 90%. he just doesn't seem to be giving us much fantasy value at this point. Howell is spreading the ball around more than expected, and despite 25 targets, he's only amassed 110 yards and 1 touchdown. This has resulted in him having wide receiver 46, 81, 83 and 28 performances. So really poor, and he just isn't a reliable fantasy starter at this time. Now, I think ultimately he is, further down the line probably going to become more reliable, but at this time he just isn't. So I don't think I could slot him into my teams, without even kind of questioning it at this point. So the next 2 players I'm going to talk about are actually on the same offense, and I think unfortunately they're not quite being utilised as we hoped. And I think some of this is potentially kind of scheming and play calling, and I think some of this unfortunately is the quarterback situation. So I'm going to start here with Drake London. There was obviously a lot, I think, quite a reasonable bit of excitement about this Atlanta offense during the offseason. There were question marks around Desmond Ridder, but with all the weapons that they had and Arthur Smith at the helm, I think people thought that this could be a fun and explosive team. And we know that London is a talented player. He's shown that on the field before, but unfortunately, the passing game has been quite a struggle with Ridder at the helm, and I think it was a really classic example, that Jags game this weekend. It was just so tough. And aside from Bijan, Arthur Smith, he just doesn't seem to be utilising London and Pitts enough to make them reliable fantasy options. And I think there's a lot of disappointment about that in the fantasy community. London was drafted as the wide receiver 23 in startup drafts this offseason, but unfortunately he's only exceeded this ADP once this season. So far, week 1, he laid a goose head and got no points, wide receiver 110. Then he finished wide receiver 21, wide receiver 79, and wide receiver 31 over the past 4 weeks. His wide receiver 21 and 31 finishes have only been in games where he's got a touchdown. So, I do think he's talented, but while Ridder is at the helm, again, I just don't see him as a reliable fantasy asset that I can plug and forget. I think a lot of it's going to be matchups, and do we feel brave enough to fit him in, or are we going to have to start him because there are bye weeks? The other guy, I think he's been even more of a disappointment than Drake London this season. That's Kyle Pitts. To say there's been disappointment about him throughout the whole of the fantasy community is an understatement, and it's nothing to do with his talent. We know Kyle Pitts is immensely talented, but unfortunately he's only had 11 receptions over 4 games so far, and he's had no touchdowns. There has been periods when he hasn't always looked quite right, so I think there is the possibility that there are some lingering issues with that knee that he had problems with at the end of last season. But Arthur Smith also seems reluctant to utilise him because, as we saw this week, Jonnu Smith actually had a better fantasy tight end performance than Kyle Pitts this season. He is extremely talented, and I do think he'll bounce back eventually, but I'm not totally sure whether that will be this season. For me, until further notice, unfortunately, he's a bench. And I just, previously has been the tight end 3 in Dynasty, and at this point, there's no way I can rank him that highly at this point until he shows that he can actually do it, or that he's receiving enough kind of volume, yards and touchdowns to kind of show that. So my favourite segment of every week is Rookie Watch. I love to look and see what these rookies have been doing, and have a look at some of the successes that we've had. The first guy I want to catch up about again this week, we did discuss him a little bit last week, that was Devon Achane. I was really interested just to see how the Dolphins would involve him in the offense going forward, after that great week 3 performance. I just think after that, they just couldn't not utilise him. There's no way you can put the toothpaste, back in the tube. And as a result, he actually led the running backs in snaps. So he had 60% of the snaps compared to Mostert's 43%. He had the highest opportunity share. It was only just, he had 48% opportunity share compared to a 44% opportunity share for Mostert. But the rushing yards he had were vastly different. He had 101 rushing yards compared to Mostert's 9, and he had 2 touchdowns versus Mostert's none. His rushing efficiency was markedly better than Mostert with a 7.7 compared to Mostert's minus 6.8. And he actually finished as the running back 5 on the week. They're clearly scheming him up, and I think they're enjoying having him in the offense, and he's performing. So they're going to have to keep him on the field. I do think he's here to stay, and I think he's certainly going to get a great role here. But I do still think that Mostert and Jeff Wilson are definitely going to stay involved. Now, because he's explosive and speedy, I do think that ultimately he can outperform them and likely will. And I think there's a chance that he takes on the lead role ultimately. But as I say, I think Mostert, and when Jeff Wilson is healthy, they definitely will be working in there. But I do think, on this offense, which is extremely explosive and exciting, I don't think Achane needs, a actual workhorse role to be an elite running back in fantasy. So I'm really, really excited to watch him and that whole backfield moving forward. I think at this point, Mostert's kind of value has peaked, and I think there's a chance now, his role will decline a little. I think you've got to keep an eye, if you've got Mostert on your team, that his value, I think, is going to start to drop. So I think if you wanted to sell him high, you may have just missed that opportunity. We discussed him in the stars of the week and the top performers, but the next guy is Anthony Richardson. Like, everyone knows how athletic he is, and we could see that all from the combine. But there were question marks about his ability to run a true NFL offense. He had, I think it was 13 starts in college. He wasn't particularly experienced, but obviously he had a lot of the intangibles from an athleticism point of view. We knew he had great rushing ability, and that always gives them QBs a chance to be top fantasy assets. But I think so far, despite what we, knew of him, I think he's exceeded expectations even more. In the 2 games when he's actually completed a game, so he's played from start to finish, he's finished as a QB4 and the QB2. In each of these games, he's thrown for over 200 yards, and he's had at least 1 rushing and 1 receiving touchdown. I think he's shown that he can command an offense, and I think the scheme is absolutely perfect for him. I think Shane Steichen, working with him, I think is fantastic, because they know how to support, he knows how to support a quarterback with his skills. But he's also shown that he can support fantasy relevant wide receivers. We've seen Michael Pittman be fantasy relevant for a few games this season. I think if you've taken him in rookie drafts and you've got him on your team, you have to be delighted. He really, his value is really looking great now, as we start to see that he, is performing at an elite level from a fantasy perspective. I do think, based on what we've seen so far, I think it's likely, if he continues on this trajectory, that he will be a fantasy QB1 for years to come. The other guy I want to mention, because he had a really nice performance in week 4, that's Michael Wilson, the rookie wide receiver on the Arizona Cardinals. Like I said with Josh Dobbs, I didn't really expect to be talking about Arizona in any sort of fantasy relevant way this season, but this team is great. They're super feisty and they're playing hard, and they don't have loads of talent on each side of the ball, but they're they clearly bought in and they're playing hard. Unfortunately, that might mean that they're playing themselves out of Caleb Williams, but obviously they do have Kyler there, so maybe they're happy with him. There was some buzz around Michael Wilson this offseason, and we were hearing murmurs that the team really liked him and he was playing himself into quite a good role there. And he started week 1 clearly as the wide receiver 2, as the outside receiver opposite Hollywood Brown. In week 2 and 3, he did lose a little bit of playing time to Zach Pascal. I think they kind of realised he was a rookie and just kind of stepped the foot off the gas with him a little bit. But then, of course, he exploded in week 4, finishing as the wide receiver 6 on the week with 7 receptions for 76 yards, which, of course, was helped by his 2 touchdowns. I do think, he is a rookie wide receiver. He was taken later on in the draft, so I think he might still be a bit volatile from a fantasy perspective, just based on this Cardinals offense as well. That they're performing really well at the moment, but they're still kind of lacking a bit of talent. So I think feisty, but they're going to have their ups and downs. But it's clear that he is earning himself a larger role in this offense. And I think, he will continue to have some weeks of fantasy value while Dobbs is playing so well. So look forward to watching a bit more of what Michael Wilson can do going forward. So just before I go, don't forget week 5, those bye weeks I did mention before, Chargers, Browns, Seahawks, Buccaneers, all on bye. So don't forget to switch those players out. You don't want to be getting L's because you've forgotten to switch one out. Super excited to see how things go in week 5 and can't wait to catch up with you next week to discuss some more players from a dynasty perspective, stock up, stock down, and of course our favourite segment, Rookie Watch. So until then, keep rushing.